Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us. For those just joining, again, we use our Q&A channel to post the questions we'd like to cover today. Once we get through those questions, it may take the whole call, but if not, we do have some internal FAQs that we've seen from this past week that we'll cover as well. Kicking things off with Natalie's question here around smart blocks. I have an email template to ask the lender to send me the forms they require builders to fill out for them. There is a typical list and then more if the loan is a VA loan. Like to add a smart block to add the additional forms if the loan type is VA. I'd like the whole list to look like a seamless bulleted list. I can't get it to work unless I add a new smart block for each additional form. Is there a way to add all 3 VA required forms in one smart block? My challenge is to get the bullets to play nice. This is a really great question, Natalie, and something that we do see as we're getting not only our smart blocks built out, but pairing those with a different formatting that you may see in your email templates. And so, Kelly, I may lean on you a little bit extra just for the troubleshooting portion around formatting. But there's a couple of things that we can do to essentially, test things out and see what kind of setting do we need to put in place for the bullet points themselves. So I'm in my demo account. It's going to look different than what you're doing here, but I would recommend following along if you can in your profile there, just to see. And I'm actually just going to build one from
really quickly.
scratch.
It's a known thing that the bullet points don't line up the way we would want them to. In a sense, it does create a kind of a gap, and it kind of shifts it. So we always recommend either doing like a dash or using the tables, using the tables within that, and then copying the table and having that table be the same in the smart block as it would be in the email itself. Another thing is you couldn't use numbers either, because no matter what the smart block comes in, it's not going to be numbered correctly, because it's going to think of the smart block as one amount of numbers and the email is already going to have it set numbers. So we try to steer away from bullet points in the formatting of the email or smart block itself, and the numbers also.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kelly. That's perfect. Let me actually pull up another tab here. Get an email template going for this. Okay. Now we'll have mock message. You will likely have quite a bit more detail there. Here are And Kelly, correct me if I'm wrong, what you are recommending here is to use like the dash symbol
Yeah.
for your bullet point?
Yes.
Okay.
Or even a table would work too. It depends on how you want it, like, to show up in the email.
Okay. Cool. Let's start with the dashes, and I'm just going to use a couple of URLs here. Hypothetically, let's pretend those are forms. Now, I kind of skipped over it a little bit, but as you saw when I was going through and hitting enter there, it kind of defaults that to a bullet point. And so if that's something that you're running into as well, go back to your previous setting where you just have the dash and hit shift and enter. That will bypass the system trying to auto format to the bullet point versus the dash mark. So that way you can continue adding additional links as needed. So a couple more of these in here. And then let's say we get to that smart block section next. I'm going to toggle screens over to my smart block here. And let's say this is additional VA form. Keep doing the same thing. So now that I have my VA forms linked out, I'm just going to make sure I have my conditional logic on here for financing type. Make sure that this is only going to pull in if we have VA selected. Potentially, depending on how you're tracking your VA loans, you may have different fields that you want to use, but always double check, make sure you have the right conditional logic before we move on from the smart block. And then from there, we should be able to insert that, my goodness, my brain today, into that email template that we just built out. Now, pasting that in, again, I'm not going to have any additional spacing in my message in the event this is not a VA loan. I don't want to have an extra line break or space at the end of this. And so I have it butting up right to that URL for the last form. And again, as we are working through, we have those dash marks already in this smart block. So when this pulls in, it should push that down to the next line item, include those bullet points or dashes to keep that seamless formatting experience. Now, there is one more thing that I always test out, especially as we're getting into smart blocks for the first time. We're looking at different types of formatting in our emails. There's a feature with smart blocks that is going to become important for certain verbiage that we want to insert into your email or message. And that's being able to turn this to an inline smart block. And this is going to be a great use case for verbiage that you need to insert in the middle of an existing sentence. I don't want the system to insert the smart block on the next line. I want it to stay on the current line that I pasted in. That's when I'm going to toggle this to an inline smart block. And again, what that is going to do in my email is I would actually see that next bullet point right up to this previous URL. Now, I don't think it's necessary for this use case, but when we look at formatting questions, always take a peek at how do I want this to show up in my email? Do I want it to be on a new line, or do I want it on the existing line that I'm pasting this into? That's going to allow us to know when to use inline or not inline. So with that, whenever we are building new smart blocks, it is also really helpful before I move on and do anything is to test this on a transaction and actually see how this shows up. Now, obviously this email is not fully complete, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to pop to one of these properties and insert my template. My Zoom bar is in the way. There it goes. Goodness gracious. Now, I should have checked my financing type before I did that, but we'll update that really quickly. Now, quick pro tip. I don't want to go look through all the fields on my field editor to find what I'm looking for. I know the name of my field. So I can hit Control G when I'm on a property. I'll pop open what we see here with this search bar, where I can then find that field quickly, change the value if I need to, approve that, and then move on. It's going to save you guys time, especially when we're testing. If you ran into something like I did, where again, that didn't pull it in because I didn't have this selected to VA. And again, I don't want to go searching through all my fields and scrolling to find that field. Now that that's updated though, I'm going to reapply my template. And now I can see that smart block pulled in. Again, double check that formatting there to make sure that it moved to a new line item. I don't have any additional spacing issues, and it's inserting it correctly based off of my conditional logic. Now, Natalie, if there's any follow-up questions, please feel free to send those in chat. If you guys ever run into formatting issues as well, and you're going through all the known, troubleshooting best practices, please reach out to our support team. This is what we're here for, is to be able to jump in, take a look at your specific scenario, and be able to give additional recommendations of things to adjust or test out. So we're here for you for that. It's a very common question that we are working with clients on, and we're more than happy to help dig in further. Alrighty. Next question from Todd here. Could you go through the ingestion process for Dotloop? I think I have it mostly under control, but I'd like to watch someone else do it to see if I'm missing anything. Is there a way to set the default values for the details questions, team and user? Is there a way to set the default values for the setting questions, details and communications tabs? How does Dotloop document import work? So really, really great questions here, Todd. I do want to clarify, are you using intake forms to create the property and then link to your Dotloop loop, or are you creating the property from the Dotloop itself? That's going to allow us to answer the first couple of questions there with setting your default team users and settings. Now, this is something that we did push up on our version 2 plans in Open and Close. So if you're on a Grow, Pro, or Scale plan, you will see this additional functionality in our intake forms. If you don't see that functionality, you're likely on our version 1 plans. And so reach out to our team. They can walk you through what it would look like to move to a version 2 plan to get this extra automation in your forms. So a lot of users, when they get started with Open to Close, one of the main questions is, how are you going to create your property? Is that through an intake form? Are you manually creating a property? Or are you, again, pulling from an integration? Even if I'm working with an integration, we typically recommend still to use your intake form, because that's going to get you conditional logic to create the property specific to that transaction. You won't see extra fields, task templates, triggers that aren't relevant if it's, a cash deal with, contingencies waived versus financed. That's what an intake form is going to do for you. And I still can connect to my integrations like Dotloop after the fact to get that additional integration value. And so with that recommendation, we do have the ability to come through and set some defaults here. And in the back end of your intake form, under settings, you're not only going to see, standardizing the time zone for that form and when the property is created, setting some of your default dates and calendar rollover preferences, but also your default details tab and default communications tab. So that's one of your questions there, Todd, of details communications. This is where I may want to have my property open up every single time to transaction details if this is a buyer residential contract. If this was a new listing, I would likely have that default to my listing details. So it's always, every time I open that property, defaulting to that field group for my team to view. I can do the same thing with my communications tab. Oftentimes for users on our Grow and Pro plans, they're likely going to choose tasks, emails, documents, one of those for their setup. For some users, that may be different. It's really down to preference. And I think we actually need to add in triggers here, which I'm going to bring that to product. But this is where you can set your default communications tab for those properties created from this specific form. To your other question of being able to set the default team and user, there's a couple of details that I'd want to further talk about when it comes to those preferences. The first one being assigned agents, because as I'm setting up my account, working with my team, if I have more than one TC handling files, I can still use the same form for all of those intake submissions and actually set the preference on the agent level. Because maybe this group of agents is working with this TC and this group of agents is working with this other TC. That's going to allow me to set their default team user and team assignment under the agent settings for the form instead of the whole form itself. And so that can be a really impactful way to build this out. You can do that either under assigned agents here. Let's see if I have any others that I can pull in here. Once I select the agent for this tab, I can come in and toggle change my team, and then from there, my team user as needed. I also can set my brokerage level if I have any branding preferences for the different agents that I work with as well. Now, onto the Dotloop portion of your questions. Again, if I'm creating my property through an intake form, it may be a part of my approval process and may be part of my day one tasks. It depends on how you want to build this. But typically what we see users doing is coming in, approving that new submission, updating their record accordingly, and then coming to the More tab to then connect to that Dotloop profile. Now, this one is already connected. So you'd start out with something like this. You can either link to an existing property in Loop, or you can create a new loop in Dotloop. For some users, I may want to export and create that property at this time. For a lot of users, that Dotloop profile property is already created. You know, we're using Dotloop for contract execution and getting signatures. And so I don't want to create a duplicate. And so with this linking property, I'm going to be able to choose the Dotloop profile that I'm using. Once I select the profile for the agent assigned to this transaction, I may not have any test loops in this one. We shall see. I know we recently disconnected our Dotloop internally for some testing and changes, but once I have that agent selected here, it's going to show those in this dropdown. Now, actually, I do want to touch on just troubleshooting your Dotloop connection. If you ever run into this where you have your agent selected and it's not pulling in any of those properties or loops, that's something that we can help you guys with. Reach out to our support team. There's a setting in the system that we can go through and refresh to pull in that, you know, maybe it's a new agent, or maybe I need to remove their profile, reconnect it to get the loops to show up. Again, if that's the case for you guys, reach out, let us know. But once I'd have that connected, and let me find another property since I just disconnected all of that there. Okay, so this is what it'll look like. We can come in, find our loop. Say it's this OTC test. Once I have that loop connected to my property, I will have the ability to import field details from Dotloop. We'll be able to import contacts and import documents. I also have a quick link to open that record in Dotloop as well, which can be very handy just for quick reference. And if I want to set up an auto sync for my open and close fields to push over to Dotloop, I can actually select a field map template for that. So that way you don't have to come back and hit this import details. Once I have this selected, if I make a change to a field that's supposed to push to Dotloop and open and close, it will sync over. So that's the initial setup, is going through, connecting to your Dotloop profile there, selecting the right agent, connecting to the property, then import your initial details. Now, after the fact, I may want to be able to come in and sync specific files over to Dotloop. And so this is going to be something that, let's say I have a new document come through. I just split it out. I know I need to send this over to that loop record. I'm going to be able to click on this drop down here to the left of your checkbox, and you'll see an upload to Dotloop option. So this is where I actually oftentimes see some custom file buttons being really beneficial, because if I have a document, I know I need to sync over anytime I get it to Dotloop, say it's the inspection report. I can have a custom button for exactly that, where I have it highlighted in red to show that I still need to do this. Once I get that file, I need to make sure I go in, upload to Dotloop, select the folder, upload file, and then I can go through, after I verify everything is done, and just toggle that to fully executed. And depending on how I build my file buttons, that's going to auto change those colors for me. So that way I know quick glance I've done everything that I need to for this document before I move on. So slight tangent, but that may be something beneficial, Todd, just to look at for your document sync, depending on how your team is wanting to import and export to Dotloop. let me read through, make sure I'm not missing any other questions there. Feel free to push those through. Okay, so ingesting from Dotloop and augmenting through the intake form. Um, so that's where we don't have default settings for importing from Dotloop to your follow-up there, Todd. So I'm going to see those setting preferences on our intake forms to start. If you're starting out and importing from Dotloop here, that is something that you'd have to manually update as you're creating your record. So just something to keep in mind, let's say I need to bring in, let's do this one. This is where I'll be able to set those preferences. So I can come in here, set the team assigned, team user assigned, and then I'm going to be able to update a few of those required fields for my property record. And then import loop. So I definitely feel free to submit that to the Idea Lab. Just looking at our roadmap and where we're headed, I think, especially with the new secondary forms and integration options with Dotloop, I don't know if that's something that will be added to the roadmap too soon, just because we do have some other areas of focus right now, but it's always worth documenting in the Idea Lab and really brainstorming with other users. If we're gonna work on our integrations, let's say Dotloop expands on their API, we want to make sure that we're building functionality that's going to fit your guys' needs and really what those preferences are. So I always advocate to submit it to Idea Lab. We take a look at that every single quarter, if not more, just to see what you guys are running into, what ideas you have on the docket, and what makes sense for us to implement in that next phase of development. So really great questions there. And I hope for everyone else too on the call, it gives you an idea of the different ways you can use the system. For some teams, it is great to use intake forms. And, for Todd's team, it's a great process too. Import from Dotloop and use secondary forms to be able to collect additional data. And so love to see the custom build out there, and let us know if you have any follow-ups with that. Next question we have here from Todd again. Can you give us a refresher on using a date template? Using a days field will automatically set the corresponding date value ? If you put a days field on the intake form, you wouldn't want to make it required, correct? Leaving it blank would use the default, but entering a value would override the default. Yes, really great questions. And I think it's one of those features in open to close that maybe not every single user needs to use, because it comes down to your contract. For some states, you always hard code the date values in for your contingencies. For some states, you actually write in a number of days. Let's say after acceptance is when that deadline would be due. That's when you need a date template. Or you can manually calculate them and just enter your date field. But this does have a lot of time savings included. And with that, let me pop one open here. Let's get this one. We may have different versions of these date templates that we want to implement as well. So for some transactions, let's say it's a Zillow Flex deal, they may have different calculations for those transaction types versus a typical residential resale without referral. Really look at the types of calculation versions you have for your contract if you're dealing with those types of lead referral systems. But let's start with just a standard one where I want to come in and flag all of the dates, deadlines on my contract to see which ones are going to have a days base calculation, where I could write in 5 days after acceptance, or let's say 14 days before closing. Those are what you'd want to build into your date template here. And so with this, when I create a date calculation, I'm going to be clicking on this add symbol, and I'm going to choose the date field that I want this value to calculate in. This is going to be really important. for, setting your due dates on your task templates, for when you need to send out your correspondence in the transaction, for calendar syncing, etc. With your dates that we see here, you will only be able to use it one time. So if you don't see a date in this dropdown that you have in your account, make sure it's not already in the template. Just do a quick scan here. But let's do earnest money due date. It's a pretty common one, which I do already have. With that, for Colorado, typically we do have a number of days that this is due, where I typically see 3 days after acceptance date, that earnest money being due. Now, I can put in my default number of days. What do I typically see on a transaction? For some states, it's always, 8 days after acceptance. It will never change. I would put 8 days here. Find what's best for you. This is your default value, but it does not mean it has to be your forever value, because sometimes I may have a client that writes in a different number of days. Maybe it's 4 days after acceptance because they have extenuating circumstances around delivering earnest money. That is where I need to have a fallback value field, where on, let's say, the intake form, I give my team the ability to type in the number of days that are on the contract. And if there is a value in this days field, it will override the default that we set. So it gives you a lot of control for the different circumstances that you see for transactions. And that's where we really, we start every account out with both days and date fields, so you guys can have an idea of how this could work for you. So with this dropdown, you are only going to see number fields. Those are the days fields. Once you have that selected, it's going to insert that field value. And just looking at this, I do always also recommend looking at your contract language. There may be certain dates, deadlines in your contract that are based off of business days versus calendar days. Make sure it matches what's in your contract, so that way it calculates correctly. If I select calendar days, that means it will be 3 days after acceptance. And if that's on a Friday evening, it's going to be due 3 days after. If it's on a Saturday, it's 3 days after. For some contracts, I need to use business because it does not observe the weekend with those calculations. There's 2 other options as well for skipping landing on weekend days and then same day as. That can be really beneficial as well for even automatically updating other date fields as needed. Maybe I want to have a domino effect to say, I think Arizona does this for Benzer, like 3 days or 5 days after the buyer request for repairs is received, then I have my next deadline due. And so I don't know what that secondary deadline is until we receive the buyer request for repairs. So I could build those additional calculations in depending on your contract type. For your when drop down, I'm going to choose before or after. That can be nice for, let's say, if I want to use acceptance, or maybe I have one based off of closing. For acceptance, I'm typically choosing after contract date. If this was closing for my date calculation, I would likely choose before. But that brings us to our, what's the best way to phrase this, Kelly? Because it's been a while since I've gone over this portion, and I always like to think of this as like what I'm actually doing my calculation off of. So 3 business days before closing date. This is the field that it's going to use to reference to make that calculation to insert into this earnest money due date field. Do you have a better way to explain that though, Kelly? I want to make sure I'm not missing any opportunities here.
Not that I can think of. That would have been my almost exact words.
Okay. Okay, cool. Glad I'm not too rusty. So with that, your date field options, you're going to see all the date fields in your account in this drop down. Just make sure you're choosing the right one for your contract. Is it contract date or is it acceptance date? Do you track both? For Colorado, I have both. I have the date of the contract when it was written, but I also have my MEC date, and I'd want to use my MEC date, acceptance date, for my calculation. So your contract should be able to outline all of that for you. And then the last options are just how do we want this to roll over? If I do have a deadline that lands on a weekend, does my contract still observe that weekend deadline? Or does it move it to the following business day or the previous business day? So I'll have that roll back, roll forward option here. Same thing with my federal holidays, roll back, roll forward, or even skipping federal holidays. Now, fun fact for version 2 users as well. We released a feature this last year to add in your own federal holidays for your state and area. So you're not locked into the standard holidays that we had in the system before. You can actually go through, add in any additional holidays that your state contract observes. I believe Nevada has in a certain area an additional holiday in their contract that we only see in Nevada. So there are some use cases. If that's you, you can pop into your global settings and again, customize your federal holiday list that the system uses. So with that in mind, this is how I create the calculation itself. Typically, I am either using an intake form or I am manually adding in that days field. But this is where, let's see if I actually just have one showing up. This is where I have the ability to type in those days fields. So loan application due days, let's just say that's 4 days after acceptance, and then loan approval is 21. As soon as I submit this form, that date template is going to take this number value, say 4 business days after contract acceptance date, calculate it, and then insert that calculation into my loan application date field. So again, this would override whatever I have set in default, but what if I leave it blank? The system will take that blank value and again, still use the date template to make the calculation. And so if for any reason that you have a hard-coded date, you don't need that days field there, you may want to use some conditional logic to actually ask that question. I may, let's say in my intake question here, is there a loan? Have an option for yes days calculation or yes date. So I can actually choose which field I need to pull in every single time I submit this intake form. So it'll give me control over, leaving this blank and the system still trying to calculate based off the default. It's a hard-coded date. I don't want that days field on my property. Because if it's used in the date template, it's going to try and calculate. Again, we want to just use what you type in to the date field instead. Now, for some users, especially if you're new, this may be fairly advanced. We do have some great article content going around this. And again, as you are working through building out these types of templates, reach out to us, let us know what questions you're running into in the moment, or bring it to our next Wednesday workshop as well, and we can continue to dig in. Yeah, no problem, Todd. And again, let me know as you're looking through things. I would clarify, do they have the ability to do date or days? That is a really helpful question with building these things out, because if I say yes, could be date or days for that contingency. Again, I probably want to have 3 options in that question here, just to get control over my form conditions and form triggers. If it's always days, then you don't have to worry about it. Or if it's always a date hard-coded field, then you don't have to worry about it.
When I did mine, I was very much a minimalist in my intake form because I know my agents didn't like to answer much. But if they waived like a contingency and it became waived, so there's no days. So I always told them if it's waived, put 0 for the numbers, and then that would override the system to not calculate a date for me. So then I didn't have to worry about it. I didn't have to put a date in there. The system didn't think it needed a date in there, and all they did was put 0 and move on. That's
I love
another
that.
idea too, to be like a little bit shorter if you want and not have as many fields and asking, but that was just something I did.
No, that's good. That's a good nugget for sure. Let us know if you guys have any follow-up questions on the date templates while we're here today. Otherwise, make sure I'm not missing any points there. Yeah, I think that should cover most of what you were looking for there, Todd. Feel free to send me follow-ups. In the meantime, we're going to jump to Ben's question on can you go over setting up a trigger from the beginning, please? I do want to clarify, Ben, are you trying to set up a task trigger, or are you looking to set up a property trigger or an intake trigger? Because we do have different trigger functions in the system. I want to focus on the right one for you on this. But we can also go over each type because it's nice to kind of cover the different types of automations that we have in the system. So starting from the beginning, as we get into open and close, when you hear the word trigger, think of an action item. This is something where I may be sending out an email, sending out a text message. Maybe I want to add additional fields to my property. Maybe I want to add an additional template to my property. Those are triggers, and you're going to see them in a couple of different places. So as we get started here, I would confirm what plan you're on. We have task triggers and intake triggers on all of our plans, Grow, Pro, Scale. On our Scale plan, we also have what are called property triggers. And I'm going to save those for last, but also give a quick run through of what that could entail. That being said, we're going to hop into our template library. Oftentimes, especially for new users, we're getting started with task templates. That is going to be a typical, part of a TC transaction experience where I have a list of to-dos. When we're in our task templates, if you are just getting going in your trial, you will see some pre-built information in here. We can customize what you already have in your account. You can import your own task templates, or you can start from scratch. Really depends on your preference. That being said, we do typically recommend splitting up your task templates to relate to the contingencies for your area. That's going to be really helpful for intake form triggers. So I don't see everything in one really long task template most of the time. There are some exceptions, but we generally recommend build a template for each contingency type that you work with. So I may have, my tasks I do every single time. I may have tasks for if there's a septic on site, if there is a inspection that's going to be required, financing, home warranty, HOA, etc. With that in mind, what you would do is look at all of your to-dos in your process and start building those out in your task templates there. As you get to certain steps in your process, you may be asking yourself, do I send out an email at this time? Do I send out a text message? Do I need to add additional information because I just found out that there is a septic on site after the fact? That's where I'm going to build in triggers to my tasks. And that's what we see with this little lightning bolt icon. Anytime you see this lightning bolt, that shows us there is currently a trigger associated with this task here. If it is in gray, that means it's just a general to-do. There's no action item built in right now. When I click on those triggers, it's going to pop open this middle window where I can see quick details around that trigger. What am I doing first and foremost? In this case, I'm sending out an email. Let me see if I can find one that has 3 actually. This is a good example. So in this task, I want to send out all my intro units. You can have multiple triggers in one task, and that's a big part of the automations. I don't want to go click on 3 different tasks to send out my intro emails. If they all go out at the same time on the same day, I may want to build it into one task, save myself some clicks, and then use my automation smart blocks to build those emails. So it's just a quick proofread, quick update as needed, and send.
With the exception of Grow. Grow, you can only have 3 triggers per task.
Correct. Yep. So with that, that's going to be where, in this case, we have 4, to Kelly's point, we wouldn't be able to have more than 3 if we're on Grow, but I can have multiple triggers in that one task. And again, quickly see what that trigger does. This trigger is an email. This trigger is applying another template. And then the following 2 triggers are sending out emails as well. If I want to see more details, I can click on the expand trigger options. That will drop things down so I can review my quick details. What does this trigger do? See any conditional logic, see who it's assigned to, and tags. It's also going to show me my trigger assets. So in this case, I can see quickly, this is applying a one sheet. Again, these are emails. Now, I need to see more detail as I'm proofing and editing these things. That's where you can click on this top left icon. That is going to open in a left-hand menu, more information on that trigger itself. So in this case, it pulls up the email template. I can quickly see who this would be going to, the roles we have set, subject line, body of the email, any attachments, default signature, etc. So with that, again, think of your triggers as action items. I want to be able to send out an email quickly when this task is due. I'm going to build that into a task trigger. Now, there is more detail with that. I don't want to go too deep as we're just doing the overall review of them. But we have some amazing articles and also some e-webinars around setting up and just learning everything that you want to get started with in your tasks and these templates. So highly, highly recommend that. I actually have a follow-up FAQ that kind of tiptoes into this as well. But that's in a nutshell, a task trigger. Now, the next trigger type is an intake form trigger. When we go through, again, ask that question, how do I want to create my properties in open to close? Oftentimes, again, I want conditional logic. I want to be able to say this is a cash deal, contingencies waived, only pull in relevant information for that type of transaction. But I also want to be able to have, same automations to say this is a VA loan. I have all of these contingencies apply, add in the relevant fields, add in the relevant tasks, triggers, documents, etc. That's where you're going to likely use your intake form templates. And as we start building those out, we are going to use these pages to gather and collect our data as we submit that intake form. We use form conditions to pull in additional information as I fill out the intake form. And then we use form triggers to take all of that information and create our property, add in the relevant information for that specific transaction. So there's a lot of conditional logic that we build into these form triggers to make sure they pull in the right details at the right time. Very similar to our middle view when we're looking at our task triggers, we have expand trigger options in the top right. Always recommend pulling that open as we're reviewing things here. That's going to allow us to, again, see our quick details, see our conditional logic, and what trigger assets are being applied when these conditions are met. So typically with this, I'm actually going to show the sort triggers. Hannah's a big proponent of this, rightfully so, as this is the quickest way to see like a 10,000-foot view of your intake triggers. But this is going to show me everything that's getting applied, quick glance. So I can see that these triggers here will be applied to that property when the form is submitted. I also have the ability to apply different assets when the form is approved. There's some use cases around this, especially for agents that submit an intake form and we have the TC approving it. We may want that TC, to Kelly's point earlier, fill out more fields. We want to keep our agent side as streamlined as possible, but we still have, another set of data for our TC to fill out before we fully kick off, our intro emails. That's why we have the ability to change when those triggers fire, either approval or submission. With your intake triggers, we do recommend always applying your fields first. Your fields are used heavily in your conditional logic. If your fields are not on the property when it is tried to use in conditional logic, it will fail. And so that is why we see all of our fields, field sections up top when we submit that form, and then our template assets down below. I'm going a little deep. Kelly, stop me if I'm going too much on this. It's exciting when you get into these intake triggers because there's a world of possibilities with them. But again, think of them as actions where I want to say, we said this was an HOA transaction. So I want to add in all of my HOA fields that are relevant. I'm going to use a trigger for that. Let's say I have a cash deal. I may want to pull in specific fields or field sections based off of that. Same thing with, will there be an inspection? So that's why a lot of users are going to have fields for intake questions. because those intake questions are what will ultimately power and again, create your property, add in your templates based off of what we say is relevant on the form. So as you're getting started, find one of our pre-built intake forms. Every user starts out with them. Come to that form triggers tab here, expand your trigger options, and just review what's already in the account. It's going to give you a good idea of how you may want to use what's already here, but also customize it to your relevant area. Once these triggers fire off though, again, that's just through the intake form. As we continue to process our transaction, that's when those task triggers or property triggers are going to be really powerful. So any questions or additions on this before I jump to property triggers here? Okie doke. Now, scale plan users. For a lot of teams, we're looking at how do we optimize our current processes and what's already in our account. Maybe we have implemented and used our task templates. We have our intake form set up. We have smart blocks in our emails. We're taking advantage of a lot of those features on our Grow, Pro, and Scale plans, but we're looking to optimize more of those touch points, because ultimately I know that this email should always go out at this time as long as I have this information on the property. I don't want my team to go through and have to click a ton of tasks to have those populate in their health bar as due. I want them to just populate in that health bar at that time when the conditions are met. That's when we use property triggers. Those are going to be outside of tasks, outside of intake forms. They relate to the property itself. And that's not the one that I wanted. And again, I can use the same concept where I may want to send out an email at this specific time as long as my conditions are met. Or potentially I want to build in a trigger, and I'll just do it with you guys, to say, if for any reason this this transaction cancels or terminates, I want to have a prompt automatically show up for our team with our cancellation, earnest money release, tasks, and to-dos. I can use a property trigger. Add in quick details. It's going to be really handy for you guys. Anytime you see this details section, take a little extra time and add in a snippet of what does this trigger do. That is going to be really helpful in the long run as you start managing a lot of different records. Time well spent. From there, I'm going to add in a condition. In this case, I want to be able to say if, I don't know what you have it here. If we have a termination blank, it is not blank. I want this to automatically populate for our team to say, this property terminated, apply my task template, or apply my document template, or send out this email to my agent to confirm these details. I don't have to, again, go acknowledge a task, find that in my list. There, all I have to do is update my termination date, and this will show up for my team. Maybe I want that also to be based off of a document. If this document is uploaded with this file role. No, that was it. Notice to terminate. That could also populate this as due. So I can use conditional logic, the and function, so it has to meet multiple conditions, or I can base it off of a nor function to say either one of these would trigger this to show up for my team. So this is going to be a really powerful tool, especially as you get started for your intro emails. There's a few things that I may want to have for conditions, but I know those should always populate in my health bar day one without my team having to click on a task to say I'm ready to send this. So a lot of great and powerful use cases for users getting started on property triggers for the first time. We recommend do a couple at a time. You don't have to move everything to a property trigger to get value out of it. Start with some of your standard ones like your intro emails. Help your team get comfortable with the new functions on the property or your triggers tab, and make sure that they're using their health bar. our motto here at Open to Close is no red before bed, because anything showing up as red in that health bar is either past due or due today. And so a couple of best practices you'd want to implement if you are looking at those property triggers. And we actually could do a session here soon, just doing a full deep dive into scale plan functionality if we're seeing enough questions like this come up on Workshop Wednesday. So
A
hope
quick
that helps, Ben.
I was going to
Yeah.
say a quick caveat to the conditions on property triggers. I've really learned that taking a less is more approach, especially if you want to have those triggers pop up and you're just learning the system. If you have too many conditions on it, you might get overwhelmed with, if I don't have this contact in here, then the trigger won't pop up. If I don't have this document, the trigger might not pop up. Yes, all those things may need to be in your transaction, but that's a good way to remind you, why did this trigger pop up? Oh, I need to have this contact in here for it to fully go, or something like that, and edit as you go. Don't feel like we've seen that if you put too many conditions, they never pop up, because as you're learning, you may have missed a field or missed a condition, or not a condition, a contact or a document. And so I personally would rather have it pop up and I have to do a bunch of things and maybe even schedule it out for later than have it not pop up at all and then I completely forget about it because I've moved on to something else.
Yeah. No, it's a really great recommendation. And um, that again, just reaffirming, that's what we're here for, is to be able to help you guys with these types of strategies. And so if you're getting started with that, reach out to our onboarding optimization team, support team. Let us know what questions are coming up and how we can strategize on the best way for you to move forward with these advanced types of features. Appreciate that, Kelly, very much. I know we're getting closer to time, so I do want to try and cover everyone's questions here in queue. Next up, we have Belinda. Can you set up the intake form to have a condition of both days and date for close of escrow? I would want to better understand your use case for that, Belinda, just to understand, are you wanting to enter both values to each field while you're submitting the intake form, and what the use case is for that? If I'm using a days field in the date templates to calculate a deadline, I wouldn't want to enter in the date field at the same time. I'd want to just use the date template and days field to make that calculation. If I could do either or, where it could be a days or it could be a date, that, to Kelly's point, you could have both of them show up on your intake form and just type in 0 for the days field and hard code your date. Or you could use a form condition to pull in the right field based off of, you say, hey, it's a days field on this contract, or it's a date field. Let me see. I
Also
think you have a
making them
follow-up here.
optional. So I do have a team that I'm working with that does want both of them on there. But to get around that, we made it optional so that hopefully they're capturing whether it be days or it be the date, but it's not required. One caveat to that, though, is because it's optional, the agent doesn't necessarily could skip over it and it's not required. So what they do to offset that is on the approval side, when it comes in, they require that field, or whether it be the days or the date, they require that field of the TC before approval. That way they make sure that it gets inputted or is the correct days or date itself. That might help.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I would test out and see what route works best for you on that, Belinda. And then again, if you run into any further questions, strategies, let us know. That may be something that we do a post on here soon, Kelly, just to talk through the different use cases for date templates and calculations like that, because it seems to be a common question, and it would be nice to have some documentation around those. Da, da, da. Next question we have. More so of a comment. Appreciate you, Todd. Opinion: setting up sub templates can be quite time consuming in the beginning, but in the long term advantages, saving your user time is huge. Yes, I fully agree. And sometimes getting in for the first time to open a close, you just need to build what you already have for your process. We have a lot of amazing features in the platform, and some of them may be new to you. You've never worked in a system that has smart blocks or has, these advanced triggers or intake forms. You don't have to go through and implement everything at once. You can ease into it. You can start with one combined, template and then split it out later. It really is what works best for you. What is your short-term goals of getting up and running in the system? So that way you can then focus on your long-term goals of optimizing your system. So there's no right or wrong when it comes to that. We do recommend it for users if they can, just because of our intake form functionality. But one thing to highlight with that is we do have a new import tool that's going to make it a lot easier for you guys to come in and get up and running in the system quickly. And starting with what you already have or where you're coming from. Maybe you have a Google spreadsheet that has your key milestones and touch points. If that's the case, amazing. Let's import it. We can come in, create that task template through the import tool. Import any of your email templates, text templates, contacts, properties. We can also now import task triggers through the import tool. And so we have a full webinar dedicated to our import functionality in Open to Close and these new features. I highly recommend for anyone getting started to come into openaclose.com, click on our Learn tab, and then select Webinars. We have a lot of on-demand webinars for this where you can come in, see our Wednesday workshop here, but also expediting your onboarding, a guide to importing your processes. Hannah is going to go over each of those import types with you. Really great point there, Todd. Thank you for that. Last question in queue here, Adam. We do record these. We also post them once the recording is available in our support center. So coming back to openaclose.com, you can come to learn, help guides. There's a couple other ways to get here to your support center, but you can find our Wednesday workshops here. You can either do a quick search for workshop, if I can type today. And it's going to show you those. You can also search for a specific date. We also have a folder for all of our webinars as well if you want to come back and watch them. For some users as well, if you come to our YouTube page, you can actually subscribe to our YouTube profile, and we post all of our videos up there so you can see what those new videos are, and depending on your YouTube settings, even get notified for newly added webinars as well. Awesome. Well, really, really great questions today. I appreciate everyone for joining. I do have a couple other FAQs that came up this week that may be beneficial for some users getting started. I can go through some of those really quickly as we wrap things up. There's one in particular I'm a big fan of, and I don't know if a lot of users are aware of this control on sending emails and open to close. And so I just want to touch on this briefly before we wrap things up today. And that is the ability to set your default send from email address. When we build out our tasks and our triggers, let me pop open a template here. Typically, I want to build it in a way where I don't have to go in and say this email should come from this person for this transaction. I want one setting on my property that says this is the email that I'm going to use for my correspondence. And then my templates are built in a way where I can say, not to use that one, but actually, am I missing? No, I'm in the wrong section. No, Kelly, am I missing this? I thought it was under the triggers. Why am I blanking on this? Default email address.
As if you have to be on a transaction or
oh, it's up top. What am I doing?
Oh, that one. Okay, yeah. I was thinking default.
Still a little rusty.
That one. And then, it's on the triggers too.
Yes. So when we set up our trigger and we connect an email, again, I want to be able to have one setting to say, use the property default email to send this message out. So I don't have to go in and set specific email send from for each of my triggers, each of my emails. I can just have this box checked, and it is going to observe, pop over to a property, whatever settings we have under the property itself. So when I'm going through and I scroll too far, again, approving my transaction, I have the ability to come in and say, this is the email address that I want to use for this specific transaction. Let's say I'm a TC working with a couple of different agents, and for this agent, I have a specific email domain that I need to use for correspondence. But for this other agent, I use this email. I have the ability to toggle and select that preference here, and all of the emails that I have set up, again, to send from that default email address will update to go from that domain. So that can be really handy for TCs, again, working with multiple agents, teams, has a different email address. I can also set my default in my backend settings, so I don't even have to select this drop down. If I use this email every single time, I can set that in the backend, and it will always associate that here for this property. Now, there's also some use cases, and I've seen this more and more lately with teams, TC teams, agent teams, whatever that may be, where there is one email in my transaction flow that I need to have come from my team lead. Maybe it's a check-in, maybe it's for compliance. There's a lot of different reasons I may want to have this come from a different person in that transaction. And the recent ones that I've seen is, oftentimes for compliance and for the team lead. And I don't want to have to manually change that. This email always comes from this email address. I can unselect this box, and I can actually choose another email in my account and hard code this email template trigger to come from that address instead. So let's say Hannah here is my team lead. She's doing a compliance check with the buyers for this deal. With this trigger, it will now always come from Hannah's email instead of what I have selected here as the property default. So really helpful for control, especially again around different touch points in your transaction coming from maybe an outside participant that's not actually doing the bulk day-to-day of your email correspondence. So just a little tidbit, again, seeing that a little bit more lately, wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of that option. Majority of the time though, we are going to have this box selected again and send that from the default email address on the property record. Otherwise, that was, for the sake of time, the only FAQ I wanted to try and sneak in today. You guys, again, asked some amazing questions. I appreciate you guys so much and hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. We'll see you next week. Thanks.